Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another week of As I Live and Grieve. That's what we do. We continue to live and we continue to grieve. Every week you hear me say, we have such a special guest for you. Today's no different. Kara Bowman is with us today, and she is a poet. And she is going to not only tell us her story and some of her experience, but she's actually going to read us some of her poems, and that's a real treat. Hi, Kara. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for your podcast. I just really treasure talking about grief in a public setting. It's so rare and so special and wonderful.
Yeah, we feel that way too. And I know I'm going to be purely selfish because this podcast, we started it in lieu of a bereavement group. We wanted to reach a wider audience. Kind of started it. It was just divine intervention, if you will. And you listened to our story, so you kind of caught that. But it has since become something that has become a passion to me, as well as it's helping me immensely in my own grief, because I'm learning so much and able to think, oh, maybe this, or who knows, sky's the limit. But it's helping me incredibly, so I appreciate it. Before we started on our topic at hand, which is your book and your poems, would you tell our listeners just a little bit of your background, please?
Sure. I'm a therapist and I specialize in grief and trauma. And I actually came to that in midlife after another career, and came to that because of a series of tragedies in my own life, including 3 cases of cancer in my immediate family, my husband and 2 children. And my children are doing fine now. My husband has terminal cancer. With a long-term kind of prognosis. We had many deaths in a very short period of time, including by murder and suicide and accident and cancer and Parkinson's disease. So I was kind of handed this career because I viscerally understood people and what they were going through. When I decided to become a therapist, I did my first internship at a hospice sitting with people who were grieving, and I found that I was able to put into words things that they were feeling that they didn't have words for yet and hadn't identified yet. And I knew I had found my niche. And then I grew into trauma because so much of grief involves trauma. In 2 different ways, either because the death itself was traumatic or because somebody had a trauma in their background, and that makes them more difficult for them to handle the death.
Right.
So I became a therapist, and then I got certified as a grief counselor, and then I got an additional certification as a clinical trauma professional. And then I'm also certified in thanatology, which is the study of death education and counseling. So I kept learning more and more about that.
That's interesting. And until I did this podcast, I had never heard of the word thanatology.
Mm-hmm.
Never heard of it. And I'm a writer, so I considered myself all of a sudden not very well educated for a writer. Since then, I just love that word. I love the way it sounds and everything. And you are probably now the, 4th or 5th person I know that has a degree in thanatology. And it's very specialized because it refers to education of death. And I kind of feel like that's kind of the path I'm on too. So very interesting. Now, Kara, your book was brought to me, and the book's title is Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss. I'm an author too. I have published a focused memoir of mine, and I'm writing now a book about grief, intentional grief, in fact. So anytime there's an author, I just love to get their book in my hands, or even Kindle, if that's the only way I can get it. And I start reading. And I immediately purchased your book on Kindle and started reading, fell in love with your poems. Then you graciously gifted me a copy. Thank you so much. So I became in love with several of your poems, which maybe you'll read one or two for us. But Heartbreak to Hope, how long has this been on the shelves?
It's been maybe about a year and a half.
Okay.
Now it's been in my mind a little bit longer. And
Sure.
that's because I, day after day, week after week, was sitting with people and was taught to recommend books to people, and had often had people ask me for book titles. And I read lots and lots and lots of books. And especially when people were first grieving, I found that they just didn't have the bandwidth to read.
That's right. That's
They
right.
couldn't focus. They couldn't concentrate. They would buy books or be gifted books and have them sit on their nightstands, and or they would read and it would go right through them. They wouldn't remember a thing. And so I thought, what is it that people need? And they need to know that they're connected to other people, that other people have had this experience. They need words for their experience.
Right.
They need sometimes to have words for things that they haven't even identified that they're feeling yet. And so I thought they need those in small bites. They need those in tiny little bites. So I decided to write poetry, not having thought of myself as a poet before this, but I decided to go after it by trying to capture one tiny little aspect or emotion of grief in each poem. And from the feedback I've been getting, I'm hearing that people are really connecting to it in the way that I hoped. They're really feeling their experience identified, and then they're knowing that if somebody put that down on paper, then somebody else understands.
Right. There is that feeling of somebody else gets it. They get me. But also, you know how it is. You have that brain fog when you're newly grieving. You get through the death, you get through saying goodbye, you get through the funeral, the calling hours, the interment, or receiving the ashes. You get through all of that. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, now what? But your brain is so overwhelmed with memories and thoughts about, I wish this, I wish that, the guilt, so many emotions, that the last thing you're able to do is to put a word to what you're feeling. And I found in my grief after my husband died, many nights I would go to bed, I would get in bed with a book. I couldn't read more than a paragraph. And I'm an avid reader. I read all the time, but I couldn't absorb it. I found myself reading it over and over and over again, and it didn't make sense. I turned to poetry. Now, at the time, I didn't have anybody to suggest books to me, so I didn't really have any poems on grief. So I just read small snippets of old favorites of mine. Robert Frost was one of them. And, The Road Not Taken has always been probably my all-time favorite poem. And it kind of served the purpose at that point too. It helped me. I felt grounded in that. So when I got your book of poetry, that's what I did. I went through, I kind of read, not quickly, but I read a few at a time. And then every so often there was one that was like, boom, that one had an impact. And I've already told you my favorites. This might be a good time. What do you think? You want to read one of your poems? Sure. Whichever one you want to read, doesn't matter.
Sure. Well, why don't I read one of the ones that's one of your favorites?
Okay.
I'll read The Grocery Store.
Oh, great. I love it.
Okay. So going to the grocery store feels like a solo ascent of Everest. I go over endless details again and again. I finally get up the courage to open the front door. I am committed, but afraid. Hoping not to break down next to the cereal. Hoping not to see someone who knows. Hoping not to see someone who doesn't know, so I have to explain. Hoping, above all, not to let my insides show, so I look normal. I am somehow making my way through the maze of aisles when I see his favorite cookies. I turn my eyes and move on quickly, not wanting to linger and let emotions immobilize me. I backtrack several times, unwittingly passing things that are just where they have always been. How is that possible? Finally, my list is done. I go to the checkout line and with my last remaining energy, tell the clerk I found everything. And yes, I do want a bag. And no, I don't need help out. I get into my car and close the door, driving blindly home, where I collapse into the nearest chair. I made it.
I experienced a similar trip to the grocery store after my husband died because we always went together. He would never let me go alone because he didn't want me to carry the bags. He didn't want me to have to muscle that cart through the snow. I live in northern New York. And he didn't want to have me have to push it through the slush. He was always there to open the car door for me. Here, Kath, you get in the car first. I'll put the groceries away. That trip to the grocery store was so, so hard. That's why your poem meant so much to me.
So it's a time you really noticed and felt his absence.
I absolutely did feel his absence and still do every time I go to the grocery store. That's why with the pandemic, when they started doing Instacart and pickup, curbside pickup, I was in my glory. Yeah. I didn't have to go into that grocery store again. Cookie aisle, yep. Hot sauce, that will just, even this 4.5 years later, still will bring tears to my eyes.
Yeah, because those things weren't just, those things were symbols of how he loved you. And they had meaning far beyond the action he was doing.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I know there are listeners out there too, that for them, that first, maybe even the 10th or the 20th trip to the grocery store has been an ordeal. Mm-hmm. It truly has. And you truly captured that. You truly did. So thank you for that. Yeah. When you were talking about your introduction, you mentioned trauma and in two forms or from two perspectives. And the first one, I certainly understand that. And I think I understand the second one. I think you were kind of talking more about trauma in one's past kind of being a trigger that maybe made a new form of death difficult to get through because of that. Could you clarify for me maybe a little bit more what you mean by that? Because I've never really thought of that aspect.
Sure. It can be a little bit complex. So this is with my therapist hat on.
That's okay.
So the complicated grief or prolonged grief has a lot of risk factors. And that's any grief that there's no good definition of it. It's any grief that's harder than normal. It's kind of the layperson's way of thinking about it. And one of the biggest risk factors is as a background in trauma. And that can either be a traumatic incident that hasn't been healed and worked through, or it can be developmental trauma. So trauma in growing up. So not knowing how to deal with emotions, not knowing how to self-regulate. So if you either have a traumatic incident that gets triggered by the death, so all those emotions come flooding back. I'm not safe. The world isn't a safe place. Okay. I'm powerless. Or you have a childhood of not having learned how to regulate your own emotions, then either of those can leave you at risk after a death of not knowing how to support yourself well and not knowing how to grieve in a way that can help you. And so those are big risk factors for complicated or prolonged grief.
Okay, thanks. That makes far more sense than it did before to me. Because sometimes I try to put my own meanings into it, but I don't quite have it right. Mm-hmm. Now, your own personal experience, who do you grieve in your life?
Oh, my goodness. I would even broaden that question, if you don't mind, to
not at all.
To what do you grieve? Because
absolutely,
grief just means loss. That's all grief means, and it's the natural process that comes after a loss. And I don't know that our brain actually differentiates between people and other kinds of losses. So I grieve every single thing I have ever lost and every single person I have ever lost. And so we only grieve things with meaning to us. And that's why we can grieve a celebrity, because they had some kind of meaning to us. And we may not grieve somebody we knew if they didn't have any particular meaning to us. So in my life, one of the two of the people I grieve the most are our close friends who were murdered about 10
Oh,
years ago. And, there are a lot of things about that death, the suddenness, the fact that it was far before their time. They were
right.
young, and we were very close to them. And there were people who are in our lives currently. These are all things that make grief harder. I think of grief as a mosaic, and the more threads it's woven from, then the more threads you need to unweave.
Oh,
And so they also had a history with us that was decades long, and we also were looking forward to a future with them. So those were all
right.
pieces of the grief, and I still grieve them because they would have been in our current lives in a very active way. So I still think, oh, this would have been, his birthday. This would have
Right.
been, we would have probably gone away with them. We would have
Right.
been here for
Right.
this party. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. You grieve not only the past, but you grieve the future that you can't have with
yeah,
someone you've lost.
you absolutely grieve the future you
Yeah.
can't have. And for some people, they grieve the past they have. So for some people, they grieve the past they never had. They couldn't.
Oh,
Uh,
true.
so if you had a relationship with a parent that was fraught, you might grieve the fact that you never had the relationship you wanted. And that can be really difficult because of the finality.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so there can be one or the other or both in the same death. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a panel discussion coming up, I think in January, that I've been invited to participate on, and it's to discuss what happens when somebody dies who years ago you really wish they would die.
Yes.
What does the grief look like then? Do you grieve? Do you have guilt? What goes on then, whether it's a parent or just, a friend or something like that, maybe that you've been alienated from. So it should be a good panel. Okay, I think this might be a good time for another poem. Your choice.
Okay. I read one of your favorites. Maybe I will read one of mine.
Please do.
Okay. So this one. People ask me all the time, what do I do to grieve? They want to know what to do.
Okay.
And I say, grief happens to you, and you just accept it. And that I wrote this one as a little bit of education on how to grieve. It's called Love. Take good care of your precious pain. Wrap your strong arms around it. Hold it against your warm chest. Rock it gently, telling it softly that it is loved. It is needed. It is important. It makes perfect sense. And love it just as it is, in all of its agonizing beauty.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Again, the words are perfect. The words are perfect, and the pace is perfect too, as is the length. Yeah, that's a really nice one.
Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you. Okay. Instances of grief, maybe, where you deal not related to death, because we do talk about it occasionally on the podcast. Grief can be over the loss of a lifestyle, or as can be very popular in today's society, a loss of a marriage when you go through divorce and everything like that. What do you suggest to people there? Where do they start?
Yeah, the hardest thing I think is claiming your own grief. So there's actually a name for this because academics have a name for everything. It's called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is any grief that's not recognized by society. And the classic case of that is somebody who is having an affair and their lover has disenfranchised grief if the person dies.
Right.
So their grief is not recognized by society. They can't talk about it. But disenfranchised grief can also be loss of a job, and people kind of that shouldn't affect you much, or loss of a relationship that isn't a marriage. And people think that shouldn't affect you much. Any grief that's kind of minimized by others. Moving when you wanted to move. So
Right.
if you chose to move, people think, why should you be mourning the loss of your old house?
Right.
And so I used to lead a drop-in monthly grief group, and I let people identify as a griever themselves. I didn't tell them what grief was. And about a third of the people were grieving a relationship, either a divorce or another relationship, not the loss of a person. And a few people were grieving pets. So there were always some people who were not grieving the loss of a life.
Right.
So the hardest thing, I think, is to claim the importance ourselves. Because our whole culture has told us that's not very important our whole lives. So we tend to minimize it ourselves. So if you look at how it is actually affecting you rather than how you think it should be affecting you, then you've won, 90% of the battle. And because emotions don't lie. Thoughts, I wouldn't put too much stock in thoughts, but emotions don't lie. Emotions are there for a reason. They're there to tell you this is important, pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you notice how you feel, then that is your truth. And then you just need to approach it like any other grief. You need to accept your feelings and honor your feelings, and hopefully share your feelings. There's a Swedish proverb I'd love to share with you. And
Please.
the proverb says, a joy shared is twice a joy, and a sorrow shared is half a sorrow. And it's beautiful folk wisdom, but it's actually borne out by research as well.
Right.
And so finding people who are safe to share your grief with, and sharing it in honesty in how it really shows up for you, not in a socially acceptable way. And that will help you move through it. Mm-hmm.
Right. For many people, finding a safe place or a safe person to share their feelings with is very, very difficult, because we all know how people love to talk and they love to gossip. So that can be a very, very difficult thing for someone. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with it. Our culture does not do empathy well. And you know what I always tell my husband is, it's easier than you think. You don't have to solve my problem. All you have to do is listen and care. That's what empathy is.
Listen.
And so sometimes people can be let off the hook if you just let them know, all I need you to do is listen. Some people, they want to help. They just don't know how to help because we haven't really trained them to help. That's why I was thanking you at the beginning of the podcast for this, because when people go off and grieve alone and in silence, nobody learns how to grieve. So we can teach people how to grieve and how to listen and how to support one another and what grief really looks like by doing it a little bit more communally.
Right. I agree with that completely. My mother always told me that's why God gave us 2 ears and just one mouth, because we're supposed to listen more than we talk. So, find someone safe. I'm going to ask you to now read one more poem. And then after that, I'm going to turn the mic over to you for a minute.
Okay. Let's see. I'll read another one that you picked. This one, to me, speaks to how hard it is to get comfortable with the unknown. Where did you go? Where did you go? You were just here. I feel you here, but you're not. Not really. Are you somewhere else? Where are you? Are you ephemeral or eternal? Are you embodied or in essence? Are you happy? Are you at peace? Will you let me know? Please?
Yes, that one also had a huge impact.
Yeah.
Huge impact. I went through 8 months, really, of anticipatory grief from the time we got my husband's diagnosis of a glioblastoma, which is a brain tumor, a very aggressive one, until the day he died. I, kind of was putting one foot in front of the other, doing what I needed to do to take care of him and help him and advocate for him. But all that time, I was anticipating what my life was going to be like afterward. I remember briefly when I walked out of the facility after he died, I remember feeling grateful that his suffering was over. And then about the time I took a deep breath and thought, oh, good, I accomplished that. I made it through that. I was dreading that entire last breath experience, but I made it through. I was so proud of myself. And then, like somebody took a 2x4 and whacked me upside the head, just the overwhelming presence of what I was going to have to deal with all of a sudden. Even though I'd had 8 months to prepare, just the reality of it blindsided me. And it was very, very difficult. So that point was so traumatic for me, and I didn't know where to turn. You know, my parents were already gone. I have 2 daughters. One's in Texas, and my daughter Stephanie, who's here and who usually does the podcast with me, she became my best friend. So, of course, I reached out to her. Had it not been for her, I don't know what I would have done in those moments. I don't think I would have been able to drive home. Yet I managed to do that okay. And I got through the days and everything, and then kind of found a turning point and was able to move on. But I was able to move on for many, many reasons, most of which were the supportive friends and family that I had with me. Not everybody has that, though. Do you have any suggestions for the people who maybe don't have family members or don't have anyone close to them, especially during a period of time maybe when they were caregiving and kind of gave up all of that?
Yeah, that often happens. That there's great meaning and purpose when somebody is dying, and it can actually be your finest hour as a caregiver. And you can pour everything into it and then find that you have let relationships wither that you need for support afterward. One thing you can do is contact some of those people. People constantly say they're surprised by who steps up to the plate to support them and who doesn't. It's not the people they thought would. And some people who get grief and understand it are there for them, and they may not have been in your closest circle. So you can always ask for what you need. This is the time. You can look for grief groups. Most hospices, I think all hospices that take Medicare, offer grief counseling. These days, there is lots of support online, including some groups that form online and listservs where you can post or read other people's posts, and get professional help if you need a listening ear. And some people need more connection to work through their grief, and some people need less. So don't think there's something wrong with you if you're grieving on your own, only if it bothers you and you want more support. Yeah.
Right.
And I like your story too, because it shows that you have to be where you are and you can't rush the process. You eventually came to a place where you were looking toward a future. Who am I now? But you couldn't rush that process.
No, it's different for everybody, just like the entire journey of grief is different for everyone. We like to say it's as unique as the fingerprints that we have on our hands, and nobody goes through it. We may get it, what someone's going through, but everyone's experience is different, and everyone's experience will take a different amount of time. So that being said, sadly, our time is winding down. So right now, I want to turn the mic over to you so you can speak directly to our listeners without me poaching anything with questions, and just let them know about your website, let them know more about your book, where they can get it, anything you'd like to tell them. This is your turn.
Well, my book is called Heartbreak to Hope. It's available on Amazon and also through any bookstore. I also have a website called griefpoetry.com, which has some poems, and it also has about 8 different articles on different aspects of grief. So you're welcome to look that up as well. And I don't think there's anything else I want to say. Could I just close with a poem that maybe has a little bit more hope to it?
I was going to ask you to do just that.
Wonderful. We're thinking the same way. Your life. What are you going to do with your house now that the foundation has crumbled? Are you going to let it decay while time and weather carry it toward the grave? Or are you going to rebuild more magnificently a palace that wouldn't have been possible without the footprint of the one that came before?
I may have to use that in my book. Very interesting. So, listeners, we've come to that time again. And, I've grown to dislike this time more and more. But I agree that things in smaller bites is probably what we all need going through grief because we can only absorb so much at a time. And for those of you who are on a commute or maybe taking your kids to sports, picking them up, I know that too because Stephanie does that, although now her boys both have driving licenses. So she doesn't have to do it quite so much anymore. At any rate, remember to take care of yourselves. We talk about self-care a lot, but it is so, so, so important. And sometimes a poem might help you with self-care a bit. Maybe before you settle down to go to bed at night, read something that has meaning to you. Read something new. So I encourage you to pick up a copy of Heartbreak to Hope and read it yourself. If you like it, share it or gift it. The holidays are coming up. And while nobody might want to receive a book on grief, a book with poems in it makes a wonderful gift. So consider that as well. So until next week, everyone, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I hope you come back again next week as we all continue to live in grief.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveinGrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.